Good evening and welcome to the urban.co.uk and National Landlord Association webinar on organised crime and what a landlord should be looking out for. We're going to talk about types of crimes that landlords can fall foul to, the signs, prevention and liability. I think this is a really important issue and it's often overlooked by landlords. We're very lucky to have John Coyne with us today. He's an advisor with the National Landlord Association and he's going to present to us about this subject and take us through some of his experiences. So John, just starting with a sort of a basic question, what type of organised crime could landlords fall foul of?
Well, it is becoming an increasing problem, but there are really three main areas: cannabis production, human trafficking, prostitution, which is really the property being used as a brothel. In addition, there's one other one that has cropped up and does occasionally filter through to the advice line, is where a landlord discovers illegal DVDs and T-shirts are made en masse at a property.
Okay, and what warning signs can a landlord look out for to sort of warn them if they could be a victim to this?
Well, the warning signs usually are wanting to make large upfront rent payments, often in cash. Many landlords are taken in by this, not wanting to meet the landlord or the letting agency, and having jobs in one location and wanting to move to a different one. Also, the other thing to watch out for is that if somebody turns up for a property in a less than salubrious part of London or anywhere else, for example, a student accommodation usually, and they turn up to a letting agency or to see a landlord driving a BMW dressed in an Armani suit, that is a sign that that person is not going to live at the property. So it's really important to be aware of some of the pre-tenancy signs up front.
And have you seen much of this in your personal experience or through the advice line? Have you seen many examples of this?
I'll deal with the personal issue first, Adam. First of all, a number of years ago, my partner and I did take in some dodgy tenants when we were more amateur landlords. That was in around 2002. Since that experience, which ended up in a bailiff eviction, we now take very detailed references and ask them to fill in quite a detailed tenancy application form that will ask for things like bank details, national insurance number, where they worked, previous jobs, and quite a lot of personal information. We also ask for 2 pieces of identification and we thoroughly reference the tenants. What I found, to answer the question, do we still come across people wishing to do this? The answer is yes, but it does tend to scare them away. Another sign is where a single tenant, which we had recently, wanted to take on a 5-bedroom property, not knowing who else was going to come in. That was another sign of a potentially dodgy situation. It is something that occurs on the advice line, and we do seem to be getting more calls of this nature.
So I suppose it's just about being sensible and if something doesn't seem right, then question it and find out why it doesn't seem right. I think if you're doing your referencing and if you're taking your ID and you know if you're struggling to let a property for a specific price and then someone comes and offers you more and upfront, then it doesn't make sense. And you have to find out why that is, why they're offering you an inflated price for a property when they could get a better one down the road. You know, if it doesn't seem right, it probably isn't. And although all of us can be tempted to fill a void period or have that extra income, it's likely to cause you more problems in the long run.
That's correct, Adam. Particularly with the cannabis issue, it's become a real problem. In the last 4 years, according to the crime statistics, there's been a 150% increase, and the issue is one that is something that the police are struggling to deal with as well. Normally, what we suggest on the advice line to our client landlords is that, does the story fit? So in other words, when the tenant turns up, I personally like to meet the tenant 2 or even 3 times. We tend to let out joint tenancies with 2 or 3 sharers, and usually there will come a second and sometimes even a third time. And I will always ask them, why do you want to stay here? Why does and basically, does the story fit? Also, I'm a great believer in going on gut reaction. If it just doesn't seem right, it's better to say no, because once a tenant is given the keys and they move into the property, it is very difficult. You have a tenancy agreement. You can't serve a Section 21 for 4 months. Even if they are in rent arrears, it takes 2 months before a Section 8 can be served for breach of tenancy. So it is better to err on the side of excessive caution up front. And as a phrase I once heard, it's better to prepare than repair.
And we hear a lot of landlords who they feel awkward asking questions. They feel awkward asking personal questions. My advice to them is always, well, this is a very expensive asset, and you're letting someone use this asset, so you're within your rights to ask these questions. You know, I liken it so you don't let anyone drive your car. So why would you let anyone come into your property and take custodian of that without asking very detailed questions? Do you have any advice to sort of combat this awkwardness?
Yes, that's a very good analogy, Adam, and it's one that I use where tenants will make the point about, you're asking me for a lot of information, and I always, one of my set responses is that I'm letting you move into an asset of mine worth £400,000 and I've just met you. If you hire a car, you're asked for a lot of personal information, and that's something that's worth £15,000 or £20,000, if that. Some landlords do feel awkward about this. Tenants expect it. Two points. Number one, tenants actually expect this. For example, I actually let a property in Islington a couple of years ago, and the applicants were 3 police officers. And I went through exactly the same process with the police officers, and they all understood the reason why I was doing this, even though they were police officers. I always insist personally as a landlord that every last piece of referencing material or form is filled in, every I dotted, every T crossed. I do understand that some landlords feel a little bit nervous about this, but tenants do expect it. I've had tenants say to me that as a private self-managing landlord, that when they went to an agency previously, they had more information to fill in. So genuine tenants expect this, and genuine tenants will not find this a problem to produce the required information. The other thing a landlord could do if they do feel a bit uncomfortable is to instruct a letting agency, even if the landlord wanted to manage the property and the tenancy themselves, they could instruct a letting agency on what's known as a tenant find basis, which means that the agency gets the tenants, references them, moves them into the property, does the inventory, and then the landlord then takes over. So that would be a suggestion for landlords that do feel a little bit uncomfortable about this. But I always absolutely insist upon all of the paperwork being filled in. And since we had that issue in 2002, it's not to say that we haven't had issues, and we've had the odd drug and alcohol issues, but I think we've only had 1 or 2 issues where we have had police attendants at the property, and that was when one of our tenants was violent with a next door neighbour, which happened twice. So I think it is better to err on the side of excessive caution. And finally, I would just make this one other point, as Adam you said earlier, it is better to wait another few more weeks than take a tenant in who is below the standard you would normally expect. And it is very often subjective. Some landlords don't like students or LHA, others take lots of them. I have lots of student lets. So it really is dependent upon what the landlord's target audience is and what and who they are happy with. Many registered social landlords take in people with drug and alcohol issues who are addressing their addictions, but it's better to err on the side of excessive caution.
Okay, so moving on, what do you do as a landlord if you think there might be some criminal behaviour going on in your property? What's the first steps you can take?
Okay, the first thing that we often suggest on the NLA advice line is to clarify suspicion with the neighbours. Knock on the doors either side if it's a terrace street, or on the other side of the street, has anybody seen any suspicious comings and goings? One thing I have found very useful, again as a landlord, and it's a tip I was given from a very experienced landlord a number of years ago, is to make friends. We've got several of our neighbours who have our phone numbers, and I say to them, particularly with a new let, if there's anything that you think that you should give me a ring about, please do. So I think the first thing is check with the neighbours. The question is, should you approach your tenants directly? Well, there's no strict right or wrong about it, but again, I think the particular issue is one of safety for the landlord. So if the landlord really strongly suspects there is criminality in the property, they should actually go to the police. But if the landlord thinks, well, they're a reasonably good group of tenants, I've met them several times, I've got a very good relationship with them, to just knock on the door and ask to come in and have a chat. Or the law says that you've got to give a 24 hours notice. One tip that I often do is that you ask to just do a property inspection. And one thing I normally use is I say that we just need to quickly check the radiators just to make sure that there are no problems with the radiators. The reason why the radiator works very well, the radiator inspection, is there's one in every room. So with the tenant's permission, you get a chance to check everything in the room. Sometimes, and very often, the suspicions are unfounded, where there's lots of people coming and going. In one of my student lets, it was just that they just had a weekend where they'd all finished their exams and they had a bit of a party that went on a bit longer, and that's as bad as it got, and they were quite decent people. If the police are involved, then obviously a criminal matter then becomes under their remit, and they will hopefully investigate the matter and take it further. If in doubt, it might be prudent to consider ending the tenancy and serving a Section 21 if it's at the appropriate stage of the tenancy where that can take place. But basically, it's best to be careful and cautious if a landlord thinks there is criminality in the property, and err on the side of health and safety and their own personal safety.
Is it best, if you've got suspicions, just to serve that Section 21?
Yes, I think if in doubt, a Section 21 does not have to be relied upon, and many landlords actually do use it as a form of potential sanction. So, in other words, if there is, shall we say, minor criminality going on, which is, for example, the tenant has a habit of coming home drunk and a bit of abusive behaviour and so on, to say to them, look, I'm giving you a Section 21, there have been issues and complaints, but if I hear no more from the neighbours, or there's no further issues with the local authority, the council or the police, then you're quite happy to stay. I have to say, I have had personal issues when this sort of thing has happened. It has transpired, it's been a one-off, or their behaviour has just been, for a period of time, a little bit going through a bad time, and so on. So very often, the behaviour does mitigate itself upon the threat of them losing the tenancy. So it's best to serve the Section 21, which a landlord can do. It's a no-fault notice to just end the tenancy, and it just lets the tenant also know that you're a landlord who is not afraid to enter into potential court proceedings to end the tenancy.
And you've heard a situation recently, I gather, about how the weather helped identify some criminal goings on in a landlord's property.
Yes, this is quite an unusual case. I attended a seminar a couple of years ago at the Emirates Stadium on criminality in rented properties, and the officer, who was one of the top Metropolitan Police officers dealing with criminality nationally in rented properties, told a story of where there was a property north of Manchester in one of the small towns. It was Bury, Rochdale or Oldham, during a time a couple of years ago when there was a great deal of settled snow in January on all the roofs of all the terraced houses that stayed there for weeks on end. It was noticeable that one of the terrace properties halfway along the street had no snow on the roof and all the others had about 6 inches of snow. A couple of the neighbours became suspicious and alerted the police. The police watched the property, saw some very dodgy looking people coming and going, and sent out a helicopter with a heat seeker to just see the amount of heat emanating from the property, which was massive. Eventually, the police actually raided the property and found there was a cannabis factory in full production. The reason they got caught was because the snow had melted on the roof and nobody had really considered switching off the machine for a while until the snow all left all the other properties, which was really a little bit of a red flag. But the interesting point he made was that they were very quiet, they were not disruptive, they were very polite to their neighbours, and there was no other signs than that. So that was an unusual but a bit of a lucky find for them, and I believe the perpetrators all went to prison.
So I suppose just because your tenants are very pleasant, personable, very nice, helpful, you shouldn't. That shouldn't be a reason not to suspect if some of the other warning signs, some of the other alarm bells are ringing, because they're likely to be nice because they want to sort of go under the radar.
That's right, Adam. And one of the reasons that they offer to pay a year's rent up front is they just want to be left alone. But usually, what a criminal wants to do is to, if I may use this phrase, quietly get on with their criminality without disturbance. And one of the ways to do this is to not draw them attention to themselves, to be very polite and respectful to the neighbours. Obviously, it can't go on for too long because in situations where there's, for example, prostitution in rented properties, there are obviously a lot of coming and goings which are noticed by the neighbours, which is why some of the latest statistics have revealed that some of the criminality in rented properties appears now to be taking place in slightly more rural areas where there are fewer houses and less neighbours to look at them. So that seems to be another way that this is developing.
So what about if you've got a vacant property? If you suspect your vacant property has been taken over, or just generally someone's living in it, or someone's living in it and committing a crime within it, what can you do?
Yes, thanks, Adam. First of all, once again, just to preempt my comments, it is better to prepare than repair, and landlords occasionally will have times when there is an empty property left empty for a month or two, or it's been refurbished, or for a genuine reason it's not occupied. What we always suggest is to visit the property, if possible, at least once a week, put different lights on in the property, put a radio by the door so that anybody approaching the property can see or hear that there is a radio on. And another very important tip that I used when I had personally an empty property for 6 months, where I used to go to the bin outside the property once a week and put a black plastic bag full of rubbish in, because apparently one of the things that criminals look for in the rubbish bins, if they look and don't see rubbish going into the bin, they will assume the property's empty. But regarding the issue of someone breaking into the property and squatting, for a few years now, the habit of squatting has now been criminalised. So if that someone is what's known in the legislation as an excluded residential occupier, then they find someone has broken into the property, then call the police, and the police will move them out of the property because they've got no right to be there. They have, in doing so, committed a criminal offence, and there have been a couple of occasions when the law first came in. There was one case I do recall in London where an occupant who illegally broke into the property was given 3 months in prison. But I think that was shortly after it became law, and very often I have noticed that the legislators will do something like that to make an example of somebody. So it's not a problem as it used to be. And on the advice line, we get very, very few calls on this on the advice line.
So with squatting now, there's no eviction, there's no rights. It's just you're able to call the police and they're out.
Yes, it did happen once to one of our properties in Seven Sisters years ago when I made the mistake of leaving it so it obviously looked unoccupied. There were no curtains on the windows and no furniture in the front room. A chap actually broke into the property over Christmas and stayed in the property, and we then found out that this had happened when we attended the property. He'd actually blocked up the front door lock with a fork so it couldn't be opened. So we went round the back and he then saw us. Whether I should have done this or not, I said, look, just pack up and go and we'll leave it at that. And he did. Obviously, I think for our members, I would suggest if you are aware of this, it would be better to call the police just in case the person is potentially violent. But in terms of squatting now, it is less of a problem now because it is now a criminal offence to squat in a property.
So once your property's been targeted, is it likely that they'll target your property again?
That is highly unlikely, Adam, because what a person engaged in criminal activity in rented accommodation wants to do is quietly get on with their criminality. Once the property is on their radar, it's extremely unlikely that they will come back again. A story I often relate to when I do talks on landlord and tenant law about this issue is one of where there was a property in Hertfordshire where the letting agency became suspicious of some of the activity going around the property, calls from the neighbours, etc. He visited the property and he actually found it was actually being used as a brothel. Now, the tenant who took the property paid 1 year's rent up front, which is one of the telltale signs, and this was 7 months into a 12-month tenancy. Immediately, he was very friendly with the letting agency and admitted and showed him around actually as well, and it was being used as a brothel, all of the rooms, etc. What he then said was this: I'll tell you what, let's leave it at that. I will go, I'll take all of the stuff away, you'll never see me again, and you just keep the 5 months rent that's paid in advance. And that was what happened. So once they're on the radar and the property is on the police register, if you like, of properties where there's potential criminality, they tend not to come back again because police often will have a note of specific properties and it's quite rare for them to come back to the same area. They will usually move on. In the brothel case, the person who was running the brothel said that he's just going to move to another town and just quietly carry on providing his, inverted commas, service to the inhabitants of the other town in Hertfordshire.
Is there a liability though if you that landlord, has he taken a bribe to keep quiet of his remaining rent? Could it be seen like that? Has he committed an offence? And if he was happy with the amount of rent he was getting and decided to turn a blind eye, is there a liability there as well?
Yes, that's a very good question, Adam. And I suppose potentially there would be an issue here about he just allowed the guy to go and didn't inform the police. He took a call and just left it at that. The guy went off. But there is a piece of legislation, which is Section 8A of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, whereby if a landlord colludes in any way with a property being used for cannabis production or drug use, and they are aware of something or they're aware of something going on and they do nothing, then they could be deemed to be implicit in the allowing of the property to be used for illegal purposes. So a landlord has a positive duty, or a letting agency, if there is ongoing criminality in the property to inform the police. And there have been one or two cases with cannabis farms where the landlord knew or should have been expected to have known, where they were deemed to be co-liable in terms of allowing the criminality to continue under the relevant section of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, for which, by the way, the maximum sentence is up to 14 years in prison. So this is another reason why a landlord should immediately contact the police if they are suspicious.
Okay, so I want to talk a bit more about if the worst happens, what the liabilities are, and what you can do, and if insurances will cover you for any damage. So will my insurance cover me for damage to the property?
Thanks, Adam. Well, the short answer is to check the policy. It is becoming more common to have clauses in the policy that would cover this type of issue, with obviously a commensurate rise in the annual premiums. But it's important for landlords to check this because many policies do not cover what's known as malicious damage. If a property is used as a cannabis factory, often it will involve major internal restructuring, taking walls down, putting cables through, messing around with the meters, pulling up floorboards, etc., installing lighting. Even though that's done for a specific purpose, as far as the insurance industry is concerned, it is deemed to be malicious damage. So it is better to check this. The other thing to check is that some policies carry a maximum payout of, let's say, £5,000. That said, I did have a conversation with a barrister who is an expert in insurance law, and he did say that with this type of issue, it's almost impossible to find something that cannot be insured for in this day and age. So if a landlord wants to have this cover included, almost certainly there will be a service provider somewhere that will be able to provide the cover.
Yeah, and I think it's just important that as landlords, and we see this a lot of landlords, especially accidental landlords, just think because they've got house insurance that they're covered, but you do need specific landlord insurance, landlord house insurance, which good policies should cover things like this, and will cover other landlord liabilities as well, which is important that you have. If you have a problem like this, would it affect your insurance or ability to get insurance on the property moving forwards?
Thanks, Adam. The answer is possibly. There is a saying in the insurance industry that you can insure against anything except a claim. Once a claim has been made, then it is entirely possible, depending upon the attitude of an individual service provider of insurance policies, that they may decide not to reinsure the landlord or for this particular element of the insurance. So it could potentially affect the ability to get insurance. What is almost certain is that the insurance premiums may also rise as well. And also, if a landlord moves to another service provider, they do have, if they have claimed on a previous policy for a previous situation, they do have a legal duty to provide that information to any new provider. But once again, as I said earlier, it is very likely that somewhere there will be an insurance provider or an insurance broker that will be able to cover for just about every eventuality.
So back to liability, is the landlord legally liable for any illegal activity that takes place on their premises?
Yes, that's another good question. The issue is that a landlord would only be liable if he or she knew or could reasonably have been expected to know that there is criminal activity going on in the property. The first thing to say is, prima facie, a landlord is not liable for the acts, omissions or negligence of the tenant. The example I often give is if a tenant goes out into the street with a baseball bat and hits a passerby, it will be the tenant, not the landlord, appearing in a magistrate's court on a charge of assault. So it's only if the landlord is aware of illegal activity that they could be legally liable.
in terms of proceeds of crime, if your rent is earned through proceeds of crime, is that a problem? Could you be party to money laundering and be held liable because you're handling proceeds of crime?
Again, another good question. For a criminal offence to be proven before a criminal court, be it a magistrate or a crown court or the Old Bailey, there has to be two things. There has to be a guilty intention and a guilty act. So if a landlord is receiving money and has no cause to believe that that money is in any way, shape or form emanating from illegal activity, then the landlord would not be liable for accepting illegal payments. However, if the landlord should have known, then they may be liable for a criminal offence. An obvious example is if on the 1st of every month the tenant turns up at the landlord's house with £3,000 and hands it over in cash, then that would actually be a red flag. So unless the landlord is aware or should have been aware of something going on, then they won't be liable for accepting rent, even if it is through illegal activity, because they are not aware of it.
And I think that's an important point you made there, should have been aware. I always kind of think, well, you've got to imagine yourself standing up in court and saying, I didn't know. I didn't know that there was lots of people coming and going and all the walls were painted red. I didn't realise. And if you think standing up in court that would wash, imagine yourself there and you think, well, no, that's not. Well, there's the should have. You've got to take action if you've got suspicions. Okay, next question. Could I be caught up in the illegal act even if I don't know it's going on? We've kind of covered that one, I think. So I think, yeah, we covered that one in the last few. What lasting impact could it have on my property, me, or my reputation?
Well, regarding the property, I don't think it would have a lasting impact because, once again, if a landlord unfortunately is in a situation where they find out their property has been used as a cannabis factory, it then becomes known, it might be in the local papers and so on, but then the landlord refurbishes the property, they're ready to relet it and so on, then within a short time it will all be history. Whether or not they may put off potential tenants is another issue. I don't really see that would be a point, but so I would think it's quite minimal that there will be a lasting impact on the property, and many landlords who've been in this situation, once again from experience on the advice line, relet the property, they get good tenants in there, they're a bit wiser and unfortunately a lot poorer, but then they move on to then have more better tenants. Regarding the reputation of the landlord, well, once again, if a landlord is quite innocently taken in by this, notwithstanding the fact that they perhaps should have taken precautions, then unless they are in any way involved, then I don't think it would have a lasting impact on the landlord unless they have somehow colluded with the illegality in the property.
I suppose one lasting impact could be a license. Could your license be taken away? How could it affect your license if you need a license for the property?
Yes, another very good question. If the property is a registrable licensable HMO or is in an area where the local authority has secondary or additional licensing and the landlord somehow colludes or is aware that there's criminality going on in the property and does nothing, then the license can be revoked by the local authority. The landlord will then potentially have a criminal conviction, which means that they will not pass the fit and proper person test, which is a precursor for all landlords to have a license. So that certainly would have a major effect on the landlord's ability to let the property and continue with their lettings business, at least for that particular property.
Okay, John, so I've heard about this false flag approach. Can you tell us a bit about that and how we can avoid that?
Thanks, Adam. A false flag approach is where a criminal gang for whatever criminality they want to engage in, be it a cannabis plant or drug dealing or prostitution or whatever illegality they're looking to carry out in the property, clearly would not be able to pass referencing and would not stand up if they went along in person to the letting agency. So what they will do is they will get a couple who will pass referencing. The gang give them £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 as basically a bribe. The couple turn up, they're genuine people, they get referenced, they then move into the property, but then hand the keys over to the criminal gang, who then take over the property and carry out their criminality. It's known as a false flag approach, but obviously the disadvantage for the couple concerned is that the agency, when the criminality is discovered, will have all the information on them, and they probably will be able to be traced. But that's what's known as a false flag approach. There really is no way to avoid it except sixth sense or regular checks on the property just to make sure it's all okay. Even to go round on a supposed boiler check or for some reason to come and look at something in the property. It's better to get into the property every 3 months just to see it's okay, obviously with permission of the tenant. One other quick point is if there is a suspicion and the tenants will not allow a letting agency or landlord or even their maintenance staff into the property, then I think that would certainly raise a red flag that there is criminality going on in the property.
Okay, so it again comes down to being a good landlord from a landlord's point of view and making sure you do your maintenance inspections on a regular basis, which may throw up some suspicions. Okay, so we're going to wrap up now, and before we do though, we've got your 6 major points to avoid having a criminality in your property. So what are they?
Thanks, Adam. The first thing is to take detailed references, erring on the side of excessive disclosure. Do a credit check and ask the tenant to fill out a tenancy application form, which actually will contain information like the national insurance number, the bank details, previous landlord, where they work, maybe even previous work. Also, it's quite appropriate to ask to see bank statements as proof of earnings, etc. So take detailed references is the first one. The second one is never take rent up front. If someone unilaterally offers rent up front, that is very suspicious. It may not necessarily mean, by the way, that there is criminality involved. There may be somebody who will fail referencing for other reasons than criminality, but they want to pay rent up front so that they will get the property. Again, be a little bit suspicious, erring on the side of caution. The general advice is not to take rent up front, but if there is an objectively justifiable reason for it, such as the potential tenant is a student from abroad, make sure that you do get a guarantor, and keep an eye on the property, regularly check the property. Thirdly, which was the point I ended up with at the end of the second point, is to just check the property regularly, at least every 3 months, and go in and make sure everything is okay and do a regular check. Or even many agencies actually do what's known as an interim inventory as well, which is another way of going around and looking at the property, make sure everything is okay. Fourthly, develop a relationship with the neighbours. They are your eyes and ears in the property. On a personal note, there are many, not all, but many properties that I have in the North London area. I've got to know the neighbours next door. They have my phone number, and I say to them, if there's anything that you think I should know about, please give me a ring. Fifthly, as already mentioned, if suspicious, contact the police. And if in doubt, I'm sure the police would rather be contacted for no good reason than for criminality to continue when they should have been contacted. So if in doubt, call the police. Sixthly and finally, there is of course the right to rent checks of the under the Immigration Act. So obviously, finally, landlords and letting agencies should make sure that they comply with the requirements of the right to rent checks, to just check that the people who are the potential tenants have a right to reside in the UK, which is one of the reasons why with illegality in properties, people do not want to be checked, because occasionally it is the case that they should not be in the country in the first place.
Yep, they're all great points. And as always, keep all your paperwork and proof in order. If you're ever asked to prove that you didn't know something was going on, if you've got your right to rent checks, your referencing, and all those points, the interim inspections, if you've got it all in order, you can produce a dossier, if you like, of evidence that you've done your best, then it's likely you're going to be okay. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time today, John. It's been a fantastic webinar again. And yep, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam.
Well, thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar. A bit about urban.co.uk. We are the UK's best online letting agent. We help thousands of landlords let their property throughout the UK every year. Our prices start from just £95, and we're passionate about finding the right tenant for you, not just any tenant. We'll be back for a webinar on the new data protection laws next month, so that's an important one to join. So we hope to see you then. As always, please email any feedback to info@urban.co.uk. Good night.